Hello, Kate Wagner. Thank you for joining us for this interview conversation with the Architecture Lobby. Um, really appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we have some questions for you. We'd love to just know about you and your work. And I think the first thing to ask about is just maybe you could describe some key moments in your journey as an architectural worker, organizer, and in your case, writer, journalist, media person. And yeah, how that kind of informs what you do today. Just a chance to tell us a little bit about your origins.
Yeah, definitely. I got my start around 2016, 2017 as an architecture critic. At the time I was in graduate school, actually studying architectural acoustics. And at that time, speaking of organizing, I was a little bit involved with organizing my grad student union, which actually took years after I graduated to become ratified at Johns Hopkins. And at that time, I had a blog and still have a blog called McMansion Hell, which went mega viral in the 2010s mode. That I feel like this can't happen today anymore because of the sort of nature of blogging is a little bit different. And that really, so McMansion Hell obviously about the suburbs and also about McMansions as a kind of locus of architectural criticism and cultural criticism, and also a little bit of humor. That turned into a more serious project after I started, becoming more interested in McMansions as a critical subject. And at that time, I started getting work as a freelance writer, and so I had to figure out how to be a freelance writer, which was actually pretty fraught. Because it's very easy to be underpaid as a freelance writer, and actually like talking to other people and learning what they make and kind of agitating for what you deserve. That was a skill that I learned during this really early formative time. And then the other key things, there are two other key things. The first, I think, has to do with when I sort of decided to become more political in my writing and not just writing about buildings, not in the abstract, but in a more kind of, I guess you can say, like just cultural mode. That happened at first during the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I was actively involved in, canvassing, in South Carolina and other places, RIP. And then there was also, I took a hiatus to become a sports journalist, which became a way for me to understand not only access journalism, but how journalism interfaces with power in a really different way than just the architecture critic who is a little bit sidelined from everything. And that really radicalized me to become a more aggressive, not only a more aggressive critic and a more political critic, but also to hone these skills of journalism that could be used for political ends. And I think that there's a pretty marked shift between the work that I was doing when I started as a writer and the work that I do now for The Nation, where I am the architecture critic.
Great. Yeah, really interesting to see that trajectory. Um, well, um, I guess taking us up to the present in your current professional role and any other roles that you have, as you see it in our kind of moment of polycrisis in 2025, what are the key problems that you engage with that face architectural workers today?
I think for me personally, as an architecture critic, the obvious answer to this is censorship, especially censorship around Palestine, which was something that I sort of came out swinging about in, I think, November of 2023. So very soon after October 7th. And that was a real sort of wake up call about how much censorship there is around Israel. Like for example, I was supposed to send out my book proposal to um potential editors at publishing companies, and I had to wait until January to do that because the fallout from supporting Palestine was pretty huge. And also, I think that this is something that it goes beyond just us in the press. It's a real problem on campuses where you're seeing really active repression against students, not only by administrators who often are invested in a monetary way through endowments to Israel as a project and arms companies related to basically doing war wherever around the world. And also because you're seeing now with Donald Trump capitalizing on the already existing suppression of pro-Palestine speech to extend it to, I think, all of his political enemies. So we're living in an extremely censorious time for which Palestine was the canary in the coal mine and always has been for many years. I remember in 2014 when Michael Sorkin was involved in becoming in critical works with Palestine. There was fallout from that as well, and that he really kind of led the way for those of us who are architecture critics in the West to engage with Palestine in a thoughtful way. But things have only deteriorated in those 10 years. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is obviously exploitation, not only in journalism, which is a highly exploitative field with a huge rates of burnout and underpay, but also in architecture, which is also a white collar job that people think is really glamorous, but it's not really. In which I don't think people realize what architects do, and a lot of what they do has become proletarianized in a way that requires organizing on like a labor level, but also on a human level as things become more and more decentralized, more and more remote. To be able to take architecture back to, I would argue, like a creative field, because I think there's very little creativity in architecture now. There's very much moving commodities around in spreadsheets. And so all of these issues are connected, right? The labor movement, Palestine, all of these things are, censorship in journalism. All of these things are connected because we live in an extremely repressive capitalist society that is obviously about to embark on a spectacularly necrotic stage, to put it lightly. And so I think one of the key things for people who want to be architecture critics or want to engage critically with architecture is to be able to see how through capitalism and how through capital flows, all of these things are related. I guess that's a little bit of a long answer, but that is my answer.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Also, I really like how you identify the kind of key skills of architects, period, as being in the realm of organizing, whether or not you use that in the kind of labor organizing definition or outside of that. So I thought
Mhm.
that was very interesting. Um, I mean, I think you've already touched on this a little bit with your discussion of schools, but I would like to know about your particular attitude and relationship with, um, let's call them traditional institutions that kind of govern or shape our profession of architecture in different ways. How do you engage with them, and then how do you critique or propose to transform them? And then, specifically for you with your role at the Nation, what is that like as an institution and its relationship with, I would say, our profession.
Yeah, I think that there are not very many publications that still have an architecture critic. The Nation is one of, I think, about seven. And The Nation is one of the only publications that still has an architecture critic that publishes on a monthly level. There are very few. I think it's only Mark Lamster at the Dallas Morning News and Inga Saffron at the Philadelphia Inquirer who still have monthly or even remotely frequent publishing schedules as architecture critics. And so architecture criticism as an institution is in a very dying phase with very little it's a little bit grim. It was grim, 10 years ago, but I think it's even worse as journalism, gets bought out by billionaires and gets gutted by, corporations like Sinclair, for example. And so, as far as journalism is concerned, I consider myself in like a little bit of a privileged position, but at the same time, I am not an employee of the Nation. Like I am a permalancer, so I'm also a precarious worker, even within my prestigious, like so-called prestigious position. And so I think it's important to be frank and honest about that. I also think that as far as professional organizations are concerned, I think that universities are failing students not only on censorship through censorship about issues like Palestine, but also because I think there is an overwhelming sort of sentiment in architecture schools of preparing future architects to be something that architecture isn't anymore. And in some ways, I'm kind of ambivalent about this because in some ways, those 4 years are kind of the only time when you get to be creative and actually feel like you have some kind of degree of control over your ideas or over, spatial realities or the future. And on the other hand, once you get into the real sort of nitty-gritty of architecture jobs, very rarely does that sentiment ever reappear. Um, and so in a lot of ways, I don't think that the answer necessarily is to just abandon all of those ideological and like very, I think deeply meaningful practices that people learn in architecture school, but I do think that there should be more realistic depictions of what the work of architecture is like. And I also think that as far as professional organizations are concerned, um, the AIA, for example, has been, I think, I often ask myself, what does the AIA do? This was a big discussion during the first Trump administration when they were kind of ambivalently like, I think Robert Ivy was like, we're going to kind of work with Trump. I haven't heard anything from the AIA in the second Trump administration. So this just goes to show you how depoliticized things are, which is really sad. But also, I think the AIA, for example, they really do not take a lot of ethical lines that I think need to be taken in architecture. And I think that is like a catastrophic failure. Especially, and I think the same could be said of NCARB or of any of the others. But I think that the AIA in particular, one of the only ethical stances that they take is the prohibition of construction of solitary confinement and or like in spaces of torture, that you can lose your license for designing facilities like that. And I think that that needs to extend to more things. Like there should be more consequences for doing bad things in architecture that there aren't. Like for example, I think if you are like doing architecture for a despotic regime, that is something that you could also potentially face ethical inquiries for. I think if you're building, data centers, I think that that's something that you have to have a discussion about with regard to climate change. There are no ethical stances that are really being taken about things like or NEOM, for example, in which I don't know 20,000 workers have allegedly already died building. Like if you are doing architecture for NEOM, you are complicit in those deaths. And these are the kinds of conversations, like forget even about labor organizing. These are the kinds of conversations that the AA does not want to have, and that architecture does not want to have, and that architecture critics don't even want to have. And so it feels kind of crazy to be constantly writing the same article over and over again that there has to be ethical reckoning in architecture. And I'm sort of like rambling here, I guess. But I think that, yeah, there has to be greater accountability in the field, across the board in architecture schools, in institutions, in journalism, in criticism, and that's my opinion. That's always been my opinion.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be a very popular one, but uh, yeah.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
mean, so the last question for you, basically kind of you've already touched on it, but it looks to a kind of future tense of what your vision is for the future of architecture. What advice do you have for young people looking to get involved and organize around the issues that you've talked about? But I really love how you identified the architecture school as this kind of like insulated place of a kind of like historical fantasy role playing of like the masterful architect as a creator and a visionary. Um, and so based on that comment that you made, what is missing, or, what can be injected into that very same kind of foundational moment for you that would weave in the issues that you are so clearly citing that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be more discussions of, collective, not only just like architecture as a collective practice, and as an exploratory practice and as a political practice. I think that is really important. Um, we've been harping against the great man theory of architecture for feels like forever. But also I think the other side of that is you have to propose alternatives that are that are inspiring. That it's like, yeah, actually, people go to architecture school because they think they can make a difference in the built environment. And I think that that is a correct instinct to have. I think it is important to make a difference in the built environment. I think architecture does matter. It matters aesthetically, it matters politically, it matters environmentally, it matters socially. And it's not just a product, it's not just a commodity. It's become commoditized in a way that is, I think, really bleak at this present moment. But we're also entering a moment in which the contradictions in capitalism are completely exploding in ways that I did not see coming. I mean, at the time we're talking about this, Trump is about to start a trade war with Canada, which is like where the majority of like aluminum comes from. So RIP, the exterior cladding of 5/1s. Um, and you're, there's like going to be a war on immigration, not only like immigration that affects construction labor, which is like the most commonly associated built environment immigration kind of axis, but also white collar like people who are working in architecture firms who are on, HB visas. They also could be targeted by these things. Lyndon B. Johnson era prohibitions on segregation in the federal workplace, which includes, not only construction, but also like the GSA, for example. Things like Trump's war on brutalism or whatever, the traditional architecture ridiculousness that happens all the time. The fact that like these things are allowed to happen because architecture's relationship with the public is not really stellar, and it allows for people like Tucker Carlson to get in there and be like, yeah, actually, you are right to think that things as they're being built now, which is cheaply and inefficiently, are cheap and inefficient, and we need to return to traditional Western European values or whatever. Whereas, like, we could have made an intervention that was different and more productive and more pro architecture, more pro modernity, because we live in modernity, sorry. And so I really think that for me, the future of architecture is really uncertain, and because we're living in uncertain times. But if these contradictions completely blow themselves open, we have another recession. The recession, or like the 2008 recession, completely changed people's relationship with architecture in a lot of really fundamental ways. And I think the biggest one was that after there was just a huge annihilation of the housing stock, people became kind of conceived of themselves as personal, like, temporarily depressed real estate investors. And that idea of, architecture, or at least of like house buying, I think is really toxic. And, if we have another recession, maybe we can, from the ashes of the old, you know what I mean? But we have to imagine a future that is collective in nature. We have to imagine a future that is fair, and also we have to imagine a future in which one, sorry, we have to imagine a future where that doesn't involve the subjugation of others in order to achieve, our architectural visions, whether that's in places like Gaza or Saudi Arabia, or if it's just here in terms of the housing crisis. Um, and I think that the only way out is through, is something that I'm always telling myself. But you can't survive in times like these unless you have a vision of a better world.